From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
We are just 2 weeks to an election, and Democrats are scrambling to come up with a new message in the closing days. Plus, where does Joe Biden fit into all of this? Is he helping or hurting his party? Welcome to Potomac Watch. I'm Kim Strassel, and I'm here today with my two colleagues, Mene Ukwaburue and Kate Batchelder-Odell, both here to enlighten us all. We're not far out now from November 8th. The left is in a bit of a panic. A lot of polls suggesting voters are moving toward Republicans. There was a Washington Post headline just 2 days ago, Democrats fear the midterm map is slipping away. And the answer, it would seem, is that they need a new message. This is the new word out. Democrats this past cycle have really planted their flag on two big issues. Pretty much since 2020, one of their big themes has been Republican extremism, a focus on Donald Trump, Joe Biden constantly referring to ultra-MAGA Republicans. And then since this summer, when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, Democratic candidates have been talking nonstop about abortion. And yet, Mene, suddenly we are seeing this shift in Democratic campaigns across the country. And a great case in point is in New York, where Governor Kathy Hochul is facing a tougher than expected race from Republican Lee Zeldin. And suddenly she's running ads talking about crime. She's been nonstop on abortion ever since June, but now this new ad, which is running all over the state, says the governor is trying to, quote, guarantee a safe walk home at night, a subway ride free from fear. Mene, what's going on here?
I do think that the Democrats really didn't anticipate the resurgence of crime as a top priority for voters in the way that we're now seeing. Obviously, Americans have been tuned into a rise in crime of all sorts, and particularly violent crimes, mostly concentrated in the biggest cities, that has taken place since that summer of 2020, when we saw protest movements all over the country and police kind of pulling back. But it's come in waves, and I think that it hasn't always stayed at the top of the media cycle in the way that it has started to, again, just within the past few months, and that's because of the facts on the ground. Generally, crime continues to rise and be a huge problem, but I think people now have a very clear sense that this crime isn't just a temporary surge that was unleashed by some of the stresses of the pandemic and pressures on police departments, that it's actually being encouraged by some of these Democratic mayors and district attorneys. And that's why they're finding themselves so vulnerable to this attack as an issue. It's one thing that there's crime, and it's obviously very difficult to put police in a position to be able to tackle it, but it's another thing if you're actively undermining enforcement of the law with policies that make it easier for criminals to get out after they've committed serious crimes. And so Republicans have discovered how potent that is as an issue, and in a lot of these races, particularly the New York governor race, as you mentioned, they are really leaning into that. And so Kathy Hochul, when she took office, she understood that it was a bit of a vulnerability. She did support the legislature in making certain reforms to a 2019 law that allowed a lot of criminals in the state to get out of jail without posting cash bail, but she didn't fully repeal that law. And that probably is because she thought she was vulnerable to a primary challenge from specifically Letitia James, the Attorney General, who's much more progressive. And so Hochul wanted to kind of walk a middle line on that issue. But now that crime again has surged back to public attention, I think Hochul's realizing how vulnerable she is. Zeldin, her competitor, the Republican nominee, has surged in the polls mostly by pressing this issue. And so Hochul now is trying to suggest that she is fully in favor of addressing the crime problem without actually being particularly specific about what she would do to do it. So she's kind of just trying to save face here.
Or potentially not very believable either, given past actions. You know, Kate, so in New York, the issue is crime, but we seem to be seeing this happen everywhere and on a range of issues. Last week, we had Bernie Sanders lecturing his party that it wasn't enough to just be talking about abortion. Last Friday, there were 4 veteran Democratic strategists who penned a joint piece in the American Prospect calling on their party to have a strong closing message. It seems the party maybe is listening. The New York Times has a new story up with the headline, fearing a new shellacking Democrats' rush for economic message. And now it would seem that they're going to try to stress some of their legislative accomplishments of the past few years, try to express some sympathy with people for their economic problems, try to suggest the GOP will make it worse if they're in power. Kate, is all this coming too late, and is it going to sell?
Yeah, Kim, I mean, the New York governor race we've been discussing is just a fascinating one because it is so striking to have a Republican within single digits striking distance here. And I do think in addition to the crime issue that Monet laid out so well and that our editorial today rehearses a litany of crimes about people getting pushed in front of subways, the just everyday risks that people perceive they have going out and around the city are really creating a dynamic environment. To your question about whether in other races it's too little too late, we are seeing, I think Republicans are up 49-45 on the generic ballot, which is a helpful proxy. And so we're seeing kind of a surge there toward the election. I do think that it is Democrats have simply not done enough to allay voters' concerns about double-digit inflation and that there have been just too many Democrats who are campaigning almost exclusively on abortion or other issues that are just simply cannot overwhelm how bad Americans perceive that they are doing in this current economic environment. The Senate is perhaps a little slightly different story where I think Republicans do have some individual issues of candidate quality that are going to hurt them. But even there, the general economic environment may be such that some of these candidates can get into office. So I think, Kim, to your point, I think it is simply too little too late at this point, and that American voters here I do think you're going to see some level of a Republican wave here, but I think it may be mitigated by some of these other factors we're describing, like candidate quality. And it may, for instance, I think in the case of New York, the Democratic incumbent will hang on, but will have learned a valuable lesson about some of the issues that she needs to campaign on.
Yeah, here's the thing that flummoxes me a little bit about this. Yes, if you're a Democrat, you want to talk about the issues. Clearly, these are the top issues on voters' minds. But on the other hand, one of the reasons that they haven't talked about these issues is because it's not a good news story. I mean, how, if you are a Democrat, do you talk about inflation? I guess you can try to blame it on Putin or COVID. I've seen one new talking point is that this is a global issue, that everyone is experiencing it. Therefore, by definition, you can't blame it on Democrats in the United States. But if you're the average voter, you know who's in charge and you know that you are hurting. I guess you can go talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. Not that anybody has necessarily heard of it. I saw a CBS News poll conducted just after it was signed when most of the attention was focused on it, finding that just about 34% of registered voters said that they'd heard or read about it. It just strikes me that if you're going to talk about the economy, and especially if you're going to talk about inflation, what exactly are you going to say? And Monet, I guess my question here is, aren't there actually some risks of Democrats now deciding that they're going to address these economic issues, given that they are the ones in charge?
I think there are absolutely risks, and that's why Democrats tried for as long as they did to completely sidestep the two very big issues in the campaign right now, which again are inflation and crime. For a very long time, I think what you saw Democrats doing was trying to shift blame a little bit on inflation, like you said, blaming the rise in gas prices on the war in Ukraine, and also trying to suggest that inflation wasn't as big of a problem as sort of ordinary Americans were seeing. For a very long time, obviously, you had Democratic politicians in Washington saying inflation was transitory. After it became clear that it was set in, they kept looking for every bit of evidence possible to suggest that we were at the peak and that things were right about to turn around. So they knew that they didn't have a good message on the issue, but they did at least basically just try to sidestep it. But now that it's become clear that this is going to be a top priority for voters, basically, their inflation message has been to suggest that they can mitigate the effects of inflation with more redistributionary policies, which I think American voters are informed enough to know that that's what has led us to the depth of the problem that we're facing today. But still, that is kind of the message that you're seeing. We're going to sort of increase spending on families and make it easier for people who are struggling to put food on the table. That's not going to solve the problem in the long term, but that's the best that they've got in terms of a policy that fits within their priority list that also would have the effect of being a salve for some people who are recipients on inflation. And with crime, I think that basically, as you suggested, they are also hampered on how much they can actually propose policies that would address the problem, because they do have this very vocal progressive flank that's going to criticize them harshly if they do actually suggest any kind of robust enforcement of the laws, or if they do suggest any kind of beefing up of the police. So what you've seen from Kathy Hochul and from a lot of other Democratic candidates is basically just showing that they're aware of the problem and that they care. It's kind of a Bill Clinton, I feel your pain sort of approach. You see ads where people talk about keeping our streets safe and understanding how important it is to make it hard for criminals to wreak havoc in the communities, but it's very, very thin on actual policies. They seem to put as little as they can forward because they know that if they actually would propose something with teeth, something that would keep more criminals in jail or something that would put more police on the streets, they're going to face attacks from the left. So they're really trying to walk down this very narrow lane of sort of appeasing voters' worries without doing things that are going to anger the most progressive elements in the party.
Your point, Monet, on the progressive pushback, I think is really striking, because I've been amazed to watch how unwilling this White House has been to craft its own message on this and try to get back in line with voter sentiment. You know, you go all the way back to 2010 when Barack Obama faced his own shellacking. And one thing he did as soon as that election was over is he pivoted to deficit reduction, because there was an understanding in the White House that voters felt that he wasn't capable of managing the economy, and they wanted to reestablish some credibility. That is something that, to me, would be so obvious for this White House to do, just to say the obvious thing that voters understand, to your point, Monet, that more spending is not the answer to this. And yet they just won't do it because the entirety of the progressive agenda at the moment is spend big and spend more.